The cold air of the city night brushed against the face of Angela Coe as she walked steadily along the dimly lit sidewalk. Dressed in a simple, practical coat and gripping her white cane, Angela moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had long mastered her surroundings despite her blindness. Her steps were rhythmic, deliberate, and purposeful, a stark contrast to the unpredictable chaos of the world around her. Angela was heading home after attending a charity dinner, a small event organized to support blind veterans. Though she rarely spoke of her military past, those who knew her well understood the depth of her story. She was a retired Navy SEAL, not just any SEAL, but a legend within the ranks. Her training had been brutal, her missions classified, and her accomplishments unparalleled. But Angela never sought recognition or admiration. She had retired quietly, leaving the battlefield behind, also she thought. On this particular night, the streets were quieter than usual. That hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog filled the gaps in the silence. Angela's acute senses picked up every detail: the uneven texture of the pavement under her boots, the faint aroma of a nearby food cart, and the muffled laughter of a group of young men. That laughter grew louder as she approached the next block. "Hey lady, where you off to in such a hurry?" A mocking voice called out, followed by the sound of footsteps closing in. Angela didn't respond. She had faced far worse than hecklers in her lifetime, and she wasn't in the mood for a confrontation. Her grip on the cane tightened ever so slightly, her instincts on high alert. The laughter turned into jeers, crude remarks escalating in both volume and malice. "What's the matter? Too good to talk to us?" Another voice taunted, his tone dripping with hostility. Angela stopped, her head tilting slightly as she focused on the sounds around her. There were 4 of them, judging by the footsteps and voices. Their movements were erratic, uncoordinated, amateurs. "Leave me alone," Angela said calmly, her voice steady and devoid of fear. She didn't shout or plead. Her words carried the weight of someone who wasn't easily intimidated. But instead of backing off, the group took her composure as a challenge. "Oh, we got a tough one here," one of them sneered. "Who do you think you are, walking around like you own the place?" Angela didn't answer. She adjusted her stance ever so slightly, her cane still in hand, but ready to be wielded differently if needed. Her training was kicking in, years of combat experience sharpening her mind like a blade. She could tell they weren't armed, at least not with guns. One of them had a chain, judging by the faint metallic clinking, but that wasn't enough to make her flinch. The leader of the group stepped closer, his breath reeking of alcohol as he leaned in. "What's the matter, blind lady?" "Scared." Angela's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Not of you," she said, her voice low and measured. The words seemed to hang in the air, a challenge in themselves. The gang erupted into laughter, mistaking her calm for weakness. They closed in, circling her like predators, sizing up their prey. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Angela's blindness wasn't a handicap, it was a strength. Her other senses had been honed to razor-sharp precision, and her body was a weapon forged through years of grueling training. As one of them reached out, aiming to grab her arm, Angela moved. Her cane was no longer a tool for navigation, but an extension of her body, striking with precision and force. The man yelped in pain, stumbling backward as the others hesitated, caught off guard by her speed. Angela's heart pounded, not with fear but with controlled adrenaline. She wasn't just defending herself, she was sending a message. But the gang wasn't ready to give up so easily. "You'll pay for that," one of them growled, pulling out the chain and swinging it menacingly. Angela stood her ground, her mind calculating every possible outcome. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also wouldn't let herself become a victim. The tension in the air was palpable, the gang realizing too late that they had picked the wrong target. As the first blow came her way, Angela moved with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural. Her training had taught her to adapt, to overcome, and tonight, those lessons were about to be put to the ultimate test. The chain swung through the air with a sharp, whooshing sound, but Angela was already moving. Her body pivoted gracefully, her cane sweeping upward to deflect the attack. The metallic clink of the chain hitting the pavement echoed in the night, followed by the stunned gasps of the gang members. Angela hadn't just avoided the strike. She had disarmed their supposed leader with a single calculated movement. The man stumbled back, clutching his wrist as though the chain had burned him. His companions hesitated, their earlier confidence now cracking under the weight of Angela's unexpected skill. They had come here looking for an easy target, someone to intimidate for their own amusement. Instead, they found themselves facing a force far beyond their understanding. Angela didn't advance or attack further. She stood her ground, a cane held loosely but ready, her posture steady and unshakable. Her blind eyes might have looked unseen to them, but she knew exactly where each of them stood. She could hear the ragged breaths, feel the tension in the air, and sense the shifting weight of their indecision. "You should leave," she said, her voice calm but firm. It wasn't a plea or a warning. It was a statement of fact. For a moment, it seemed like they might take her advice. One of the younger men, barely more than a teenager, muttered something under his breath and began to step back. But the leader wasn't ready to admit defeat. Humiliated and furious, he spat on the ground and growled, "You think you're tough because you got lucky. You don't know who you're messing with." Angela tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. She didn't respond, didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. It was the silence of someone who had faced real danger, real enemies, and had come out the other side unbroken. These men were nothing more than a temporary obstacle, and she wasn't going to waste her breath convincing them of that. The leader gestured to one of his friends, urging him to attack. The man hesitated but ultimately lunged forward, his fists swinging wildly. Angela moved with precision, sidestepping the clumsy attack and using her cane to sweep his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, groaning in pain as he clutched his knee. The others froze, their bravado crumbling completely. They weren't fighters. They were bullies, used to preying on the vulnerable. And now, faced with someone who wasn't afraid of them, they didn't know what to do. But Angela knew. She could end this quickly, make it clear that they had no chance against her. Yet she held back, not because she doubted her ability, but because she understood the deeper implications of what was happening. These weren't hardened criminals. They were young men making bad choices, caught up in a toxic cycle of anger and insecurity. She didn't want to destroy them. She wanted them to understand the consequences of their actions. "You've made your point," she said, her tone steady but edged with authority. "Now walk away before this gets worse." The leader hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced at his fallen friend. He wanted to fight, wanted to prove something, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Angela could hear it in his shaky breaths, see it in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was on the verge of running, but his pride was holding him back. Angela sighed softly, her grip on the cane relaxing just enough to signal that she wasn't going to strike again unless she had to. "You think being tough means hurting people? It doesn't. Real strength is knowing when to stop." For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Then, one by one, the gang members began to retreat. The leader lingered for a moment longer, his eyes burning with resentment, but even he seemed to understand that he was outmatched. With a muttered curse, he turned and followed the others into the shadows. Angela waited until their footsteps faded completely before letting out a slow breath. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp and focused began to ebb, leaving a familiar ache in her muscles. She leaned on her cane, her mind racing even as her body remained still. This wasn't the first time she had encountered trouble on the streets, but it was the first time in years that she'd been forced to defend herself so openly. It stirred memories she had tried to leave behind, memories of missions gone wrong, of enemies who underestimated her, of battles fought in the dead of night. Her past wasn't something she talked about, not even with the people closest to her. Few knew the truth about Angela Cole, the woman who had once been known as Ghost among her fellow SEALs. The nickname wasn't just a reflection of her ability to move unseen. It was a testament to her resilience, her ability to endure and adapt no matter what challenges came her way. But being a ghost came with its own burdens. It meant living in the shadows, carrying secrets that couldn't be shared. Angela had always accepted that as part of the job, but now, years after leaving the military, she was starting to wonder if the shadows would ever truly let her go. As she resumed her walk home, her mind wandered back to the events of the evening. The gang had been foolish, reckless, but their actions were a symptom of something larger. The city had changed in recent years, its sense of community eroded by economic struggles and social divisions. People were angry, scared, and desperate, and that desperation often found an outlet in the wrong places. Angela couldn't fix all of it. She wasn't a politician or a social worker, but she could do something, even if it was just being a reminder that strength didn't have to come at the expense of others. She had spent her life protecting people, and that instinct wasn't something she could turn off, no matter how much she tried to live a quiet, ordinary life. As she reached her apartment building, Angela paused for a moment, her hand resting on the door handle. The faint hum of the city buzzed in the background, a constant reminder of the world she had chosen to rejoin after her time in the military. She had thought she could leave her past behind, but tonight had proven otherwise. The skills, the instincts, the sense of duty, they were all still there, as much a part of her as the blood in her veins. And maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Angela stepped inside, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty hallway. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done fighting. Not for herself and not for the people who needed her, even if they didn't realize it yet. Inside her small, meticulously organized apartment, Angela hung up her coat and folded her cane neatly by the door. The warm light of the room felt like a stark contrast to the cold tension lingering in her chest. She had always chosen simplicity in her surroundings, a quiet space where she could think, where she didn't need to rely on sight to know where everything was. Tonight, though, even the comfort of her sanctuary wasn't enough to shake the unease that crept into her thoughts. She moved to the kitchen, her movements automatic as she brewed a cup of chamomile tea. The rhythmic sound of water boiling and the soft clink of the spoon against porcelain gave her a small sense of calm. But her mind was still replaying the encounter with the gang, analyzing every detail. She could picture their faces in her mind, even though she hadn't seen them. The tone of their voices, their hesitation, their fear, all of it painted a vivid picture in her memory. Angela knew better than to dismiss the encounter as a one-off. Something about it felt wrong, bigger than a random act of aggression. She had learned to trust her instincts, and they were telling her that this wasn't over. The leader's parting words echoed in her mind, angry, bitter, and full of resentment. People like him didn't let things go easily. She took her tea to the small living room and sat down on the couch, her fingers tracing the edge of the mug as she let her thoughts wander. For years, she had worked to stay under the radar, to live a life that didn't draw attention. But the world didn't always let you disappear, especially when you had a past like hers. Angela wasn't naive enough to think that her actions tonight wouldn't have consequences. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting her from her thoughts. She picked it up and recognized the caller ID immediately. Detective Marcus Rayner. Angela hesitated for a moment before answering. Marcus was an old friend, one of the few people who knew the truth about her past. He had been a young rookie when they first met, fresh out of the academy and full of idealism. Over the years, they had stayed in touch, their friendship built on mutual respect and shared secrets. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady. "What's going on?" "I was hoping you could tell me," Marcus replied, his tone serious. "We got a report about some trouble near your neighborhood tonight. A group of young men, one of them with a busted knee and another with a sprained wrist. They're claiming they were attacked." Angela's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Is that so?" Marcus sighed on the other end of the line. "Angela, don't play coy with me. I know you were involved. The description matches, and let's be honest. You're not exactly the type to let something like that slide." "They started it," she said simply, taking a sip of her tea. "I finished it." "I figured as much," Marcus said, "but you need to be careful. These guys aren't just some random punks. Their leader, Trey Hall, has connections. Nothing solid, but enough to make him dangerous. He's been on our radar for a while, but we haven't been able to pin anything on him." Angela frowned, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Connections to who?" "Small-time gangs mostly, but there's a lot of chatter about something bigger. Drugs, weapons, maybe even human trafficking. We don't have all the details yet, but Trey seems to be climbing the ranks." Angela's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information. She had dealt with men like Trey before, opportunists who thrived on chaos and intimidation. They didn't care who they hurt as long as it served their agenda. And if Trey was involved in something bigger, then tonight's encounter was more than just bad timing. It was a warning sign. "Marcus, do you think they'll come after me?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "I'd be lying if I said no," Marcus admitted. "Trey doesn't take humiliation lightly. He'll want to save face, especially if he thinks his reputation is at stake. But Angela, if he finds out who you really are, he might think twice." "That's assuming he finds out," Angela said. "I'm not planning on advertising my history." "Good," Marcus said, his tone softening. "But watch your back, and if anything feels off, you call me." "I will," she promised, though she doubted she'd need to. Angela had spent years handling threats far worse than Trey Hall, but she appreciated Marcus's concern, even if she didn't fully share it. After ending the call, Angela sat in silence for a long moment, her tea growing cold in her hands. She knew she couldn't ignore the situation. If Trey was involved in something as dangerous as Marcus suggested, then this wasn't just about her anymore. The people in her neighborhood, good, hard-working people, could be caught in the crossfire, and Angela couldn't stand by and let that happen. She leaned back against the couch, her mind working through the possibilities. She had always been a strategist, someone who thought 3 steps ahead. It was a skill that had served her well in the military, and it was one she would need now. But this time, she wasn't working with a team or following orders. She was on her own. As the hours passed, Angela began to piece together a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without risks. But she wasn't the type to wait for trouble to find her. She would find it first.